I don't think I need it, to be honest. My work is on military organizations. As a researcher, that's what I study most of the time. Gender aspects of it, but also peacekeeping, the use of violence, right, as a political tool. As an activist, I work with military organizations, and that might make you a little uncomfortable. I'm not saying I'm working against them, I'm saying I'm working with military organizations to instigate change. So why would I be here talking about military organizations? Aren't they the problem? They are surely the final bastion of exclusive, hyper-masculine male organizations, right? There's no doubt about that. They're also all about violence. They use violence to achieve political ends. So in that sense, they are perpetrators, whether we think of them as for good or for very, very much bad in terms of sexual and gender-based violence, violence against civilians, etc., etc. The list can be made very long when we describe the military as a problem. But we also look to the military as a solution sometimes. And this is where it gets tricky when it comes to the more pacifist, nonviolent agenda that was the foundation of Resolution 1325. But we also look to the military as the protectors, as those defending women in the Eastern Congo against sexual violence, for example. So that means, whether we like it or not, the military is at the core of everything we are talking about here when it comes to women's empowerment, demilitarization, etc., etc. So when we talk about engaging men, we also have to engage the military. So what is the military? If we want to engage them, we better understand what it is we're talking about. And let me reduce it to its very most simple function. It's about violence. It is a tool to achieve political ends through the means of violence. If you take away the violence and the weapons from the military, they are nothing. And we mustn't forget that. And when we ask them, so what's the purpose of the violence? Well, it's to defend the nation, defend the people, or the constitution, depending on which country you're in. That's the heart of it. And that also means that the military, it trains, it recruits, it equips, it creates a culture, all specified to achieve that end and to do it as effectively as possible. So what we're talking about here is an organization that is perfectly set up to use violence as effectively as possible. And that should make us all uncomfortable, I guess. But what does that have to do with anything? Well, Anthony described a process in conflict where boys are sort of trained as soldiers through the act of play. If you're familiar with Josh Goldstein's work on war and gender, you will also know that this is something which Anthony also highlighted. It's part of every society. And if there's one constant throughout history, throughout culture, it is that we have always educated and socialized boys into potential soldiers, warriors, so that they can perform the task of being professional and effective agents of violence in war. Right? So we have a pretty awful feedback loop that because societies want to defend themselves, they need military institutions. And because we need military institutions to defend societies, we also need to populate them with experts in violence, which traditionally have been men. And we have socialized the boys into those experts in violence. So that means if we want to stop this cycle of violence, war, and the socialization of boys into soldiers, well, the military is a pretty important place to work. We cannot overlook it, and we are probably very unlikely to stop war and violence unless we also engage the agents of that violence, right? So that's sort of my argument why we should engage the military, regardless of how uncomfortable it might be. But we also have to do it right. And in terms of full disclosure, I'm also a reserve officer in the Swedish Army, a captain. I haven't wearing my uniform. I could probably not even button it right at this stage. It's a long time. But in that sense, I also feel I'm a representative of something here. But engaging the military then, if we want to work them, and normally my normal constituents are sort of the military themselves. So my speeches are about how can we engage these issues. And here, a very different kind of an audience. So the question is, how can you engage the military? How can you affect it for positive change? And this is obviously under the assumption that we can't just outlaw the military at this stage or outlaw war. That's while the ideal notion would be to simply throw away the military and violence and war. It's not likely to happen very soon, at least. So that means we have to think about how we can engage the military to create small and perhaps incremental changes for the better. Because face it, there's violence and there's violence, and there's different organizations in the military behaving differently. Really interesting work by Elizabeth Wood highlight that there's also very different kinds of sexual violence. And in some conflicts, there's guerrilla groups using lots and lots of sexual violence as a tool in war. And others, they never use it. So why is that? What is it in military organizations that sometimes lead them to sexual violence as a tool and sometimes not? That's an important thing to understand. There's also a difference between, let me exaggerate a little, Scandinavian peacekeepers with one mindset on the one side, and then the more extreme version, perhaps the US Marine Corps, having a culture of extreme violence, recruiting, training to make sure that everyone always applies a maximum amount of violence in every occasion. So there's very big differences, and we can work with organizations to highlight what's effective and not. And that leads me then to how engage. First of all, I advocate an instrumental approach. There's no doubt that this is all a normative agenda, and what we're working for is gender justice, women's rights, and equality. But those arguments are completely irrelevant to the military. Again, they're in the business of winning war, they say. And if you raise issues of women's rights and equality, they might say, yes, we believe in all that, and that's what we are protecting. That's our task as the military. But it doesn't seem to resonate to how they operate, how they organize, how they train, how they equip. And that's where one can make an argument. Well, actually, by understanding these issues, you can be more effective at what you do. And suddenly you'll see a little light go on in military officers' brains, and they're like, okay, I'm going to listen a few more minutes at least before I throw you out. But that is a door opener. And I know that is also a very controversial argument, that we should help the military become more effective by teaching them gender. That's not what 1325 was about. That's not what women's rights are about. But you shouldn't underestimate the ripples on the water. When you teach someone gender issues, gender awareness, when you teach them about the importance of women's rights, that is a very powerful thing. And I've seen it in a lot of very hardcore, middle-aged military men. When the light goes on, it's the point of no return, which means it is a backdoor. And when you start having people within the organization think this way, it has tremendous impacts on other issues. And you create a cadre of people with which you can work very well. And that leads to my second argument. We have to work from the inside as well. We should definitely continue to push the military from the outside through legislation and through activism, non-violent movements of pacifism. But we also have to work from within. The military can only change. It's an enormous bureaucracy with tremendous power. Hardly anyone can tell the military to do anything, not even our politicians, if they don't want to. They hold the reins of power themselves. If you want to change the military, work within, change their mindsets. And that means we have to not only engage with them, we have to try to work inside of them with them, to have gender champions within the military. And we have one in the Australian Armed Forces, obviously, General Morrison, who's a tremendous champion of these issues. And if you haven't seen his clips on YouTube, well, take a look. It's pretty powerful. So it's a matter of working with and not against, is my argument, if we really want to change these organizations. And then another slightly controversial argument, and that is we have to be strategic and sometimes a little bit limited in our approach. If we go all out, if we emphasize that this is all about gender equality at the end, that's why we're doing this, you will meet too much resistance, and that will hinder your effectiveness. So the question is, how can we get these gender champions within the organizations? How can we get a few gender advisors in the organizations? That will change a few minds. That will then create these ripples of bigger change. If we say we have to gender mainstream everything, every aspect of recruitment, training, exercising, from the very outset, again, you will face too much resistance. So where can you start? How can you make sure that it leads in the right direction? So don't forget what this is all about in the end, and make sure that this is not appropriated by men for a different purpose either, which is, I think, is a theme of the whole conference. So, final word. We want to engage men, not throughout this conference, not as the problem, but also as the potential collaborator, ally, if you will, for women's rights, women's equality. I would take that one step further. We should also engage military organizations, not just as the problem, but also as a potential partner. And I think going back to Josh Goldstein's argument and the feedback loop, the military is an enormous role model for boys in every society. Boys look to the military as a role model for manhood. Now, if the military can change and question what it means to be man or masculine, then that's also going to have an important impact on society at large. Thank you very much.
I'd like to get just another quick round of applause for the entire panel. Thank you very much for all of this, again, very thought-provoking stuff. All right, let's open the floor to a few questions, if I can get this microphone working.
Perfect. Okay, so what we'd like to do, because we have limited time, I'd like to take 4 quick questions. Please be very brief, very specific, and then we will turn it back to the panel to share their comments. So I saw one hand over here.
Hello. My name is Sandeep. I work in India, and my organization works for conflict resolution, and my organization works on Gandhian values. We work in communal rights. My question is to Robert Engen, and my doubt is it an idealism of working with military for peace building? Because military is a violence. It's a war machine. Military is. So how military reacts to your efforts? That is my question. And the next question is, anyone of you can give me the answer. Do you use Gandhian techniques in your peace building and non-violent processes? And do you think he is useful for your process?
Thanks to all fantastic presentations. I could ask questions of all of you. For now, if you don't mind, I'll ask Robert Egnall. Could you talk a little bit, please, about applying the principles that you're talking about? Could you talk a little bit, please, about whether the type of principles that you're talking about are applicable to paramilitary groups and other groups that lack the command structure of a conventional military?
Question, I think, over here. I saw a hand over here. Oh, yes.
Please, can anyone translate for me? I can speak in Urdu. Yes. मेरा नाम तबस्सुम अदनान है और मेरा ताल्लुक़ सवात पाकिस्तान से है और मैं फर्स्ट फीमेल जिरगे की फाउंडर एंड चेयरपर्सन हूँ। मैं सिर्फ एक बात कहना चाहती हूँ, कोई सवाल नहीं करना चाहती, कि जिस तरह से रॉबर्ट सर ने कहा कि हमें आर्मी को भी, मिलिट्री को भी जो है इंगेज करना चाहिए, तो मैं इनकी इस बात से इत्तेफाक रखती हूँ, क्योंकि हमारे इलाके में भी आर्मी की रेड है, वहाँ पर आर्मी फैली हुई है। तो मैं चूँकि एक जिरगा सिस्टम चलाती हूँ, एक वुमेन काउंसिल चलाती हूँ, तो उसमें काफ़ी सारे केसेस मेरे सामने ऐसे आते हैं जहाँ मुझे उनके पास जाना पड़ता है, मुझे उनसे बात करनी पड़ती है और वहाँ से मुझे उनका बहुत अच्छा रिस्पांस आता है और उनको भी एक ऐसा फील होता है कि उनको भी इज़्ज़त मिल रही है, कि ना कि उनकी बेइज्जती हो रही है। तो बाज़ दफ़ा ये होता है कि हमारे लोग उनके मुंह पर भी कह देते हैं कि ये तो हमें परेशान कर रहे हैं, लेकिन असल में ऐसा नहीं होता, क्योंकि अगर मिलिट्री नहीं होती तो हमारे इलाके से शायद तालिबान का जाना बहुत मुश्किल होता।
And she basically is saying that she doesn't have a question, but she wants to comment on Robert's presentation. And she agrees with his approach that one needs to engage with the army and the military, because the area that she belongs to and where she is leading women's councils, she says that it would be impossible for women to survive and to be able to do what they are doing had it not been for the military and for them to have provided the protection and ousted the Taliban from the area that she comes from. So she feels that it's very important to engage with the military, even when in the initial phase there is some hesitation, but it still is important.
Thank you so much. I think we had one in the back.
Quick question, or two quick questions. One for Onan. I wondered about like the healing work that's been done with the male survivors. I wondered about that as a space for reconstructing a different masculine identity, given the association between crisis of masculinity and the trauma that's been experienced as a result of the violence, and how you are kind of working with that. And then a quick question for Robert in terms of, you know, if you think about like what kinds of work you try and do with the military, and whether it's less about kind of gender education or education about gender and human rights, and more about kind of gender-based psychosocial support for helping particularly returning veterans. If you think about the US military and the extraordinarily high rates of domestic and sexual violence that have been reported within the US military veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. So how do we work with those men to deal with the stresses of return?
Okay, let's turn it over to the panel, and we're running out of time. So for anyone to any additional comments or remarks that you would like to make, please feel free to go ahead. Whoever, do we just want to maybe go across, start with Anthony, and then go give everyone a moment to speak?
Okay, I don't have too much to say, but okay. A lot is being said about military and working with the military, and I actually agree that we need to work with the military. But I think comments like, okay, the military is necessary in a system that we have developed where violence is the answer. That's the problem, that we need to work with the military to protect women from other militant groups who are using violence, because the system operates on violence. So now the question becomes how to deviate from that system. So working within the military is not necessarily the evil. Working within the military without changing the function of the military, or how we approach violence, or the fact that women need a higher hyper-masculine power to protect them from other masculine powers who are using violence, that's the problem. So we need to start questioning systems, and we need to be practical in the work. I'm not saying be too ideal, but at the same time not forget that it's that same system that makes the military such a requirement, and we should question that all the time. That's it.
There was a lot of questions about the military, and I'm afraid I think I forgot the first one. Could you remind me, just very briefly, what
I
is?
ask you that, is it not ideally because military is a war machine?
Yeah. I mean, it's a constant tension working with the military. It is a tool of violence and power. It stands for everything that we are working against at this conference. But that doesn't mean we can exclude it. My boss, Milan Verveer, talked about glass ceilings the other week on a conference about women's empowerment. And she said at the end of the day, it's not really glass ceilings we're talking about. It's a very thick layer of men. And we have the same problem, right, when it comes to the military. It's standing in the way, but it's also a potential partner for really important social change in every society. If the armed forces, if professional sports teams, sort of male role models can change, then there's nowhere else where we can sort of support exclusive masculinity and hypermasculinity, etc. So for me, there's high rewards, but also it's very hard, because the question was, how do they react? And usually they simply ignore it as irrelevant. I sometimes receive a bit of understanding, but that's when we talk about Afghanistan and how they can improve operations, how they can gather more intelligence, etc. Things that are specifically military tactical. That's where it resonates with them. And I think that's a good starting point. It's not the end of the ambition, obviously, but if they can start understanding gender perspectives for that purpose, that's a little victory at least. It can also help them better protect. If they have a protection mandate in operations, well, they cannot execute that very effectively if they also don't understand gender issues. So that's another part of the argument. There was a question about if these principles apply to other organizations, paramilitary, police, for example, and I would definitely say yes to that. I would also say that it probably applies to all organizations that are part of the existing power structures and patriarchy, which is every organization in the world mostly, right? I was at a panel last week and with representatives from USAID and State Department, and they shared almost the exact same lessons learned when it comes to changing organizations. So this is not unique to the military, this instrumental, insider-based, sort of these arguments that I just made on how to change. It relates to most organizations. And by the way, very quickly on the gender-based psychosocial work, I have not done any of that, but it's excellent. I would like to hear more, because I think it's another really good argument for understanding gender perspectives within the military. If they can also deal with veterans better, another instrumental argument for change.
Thank you so much for your question regarding healing techniques for male survivors. I think in our work we try to address all the 5 P's of sexual violence. By the 5 P's I mean the consequences, like in terms of psychological, psychosocial, physical, psychosexual, and political effects of sexual violence. So for the psychological one, we do both individual, couple, group, and family counseling sessions, including therapy for survivors. If their families are willing, we also do home-based care and support for those ones undergoing medical support. Then for the psychosocial bit, we often use trained peer counselors that we pick from within the groups who can extend the support to fellow survivors. For the physical and psychosexual, we use the medics. We use both government and private medical service providers to first sort the medical needs before we can kick on for the survivors to recover in the process. For the political bit, we often use government. Like he has mentioned about the army, I would like to say in terms of response, it's really, really difficult to involve the military. We've tried. But in terms of preventive approaches, I think it seems to work. We launched a documentary for male survivors of sexual violence, and then we called the army commander to come and officiate in the launch. He gave good pledges. We are willing to support, but only if you are able to identify the perpetrator. Now, how would we, as an agency, how would you go in the crowd of 100 soldiers and point that this is the one who did it to me? So, but they say we are willing to take it forward. They're also organizing that we go and train them. So in terms of the prevention approaches, it might work for the trainings that they have said, please come and train us on gender. We are willing to take it on. Thank you.
I just also wanted to pick up on the point about the military, because in peace processes they're an incredibly dominant actor. And what we see typically in peace processes is that the government and the military are decoupled, and you frequently have them negotiating as separate entities, when you would actually think that the government was the chief entity and the military was underneath them. But in the real world, that's not how it works. So as people that are providing advice on a whole range of issues in peace processes, you deal with the government separately and the military. And in my experience, those individuals from the army in peace negotiations are often, in some senses, the least complicated characters to deal with, because what you're able to do is to appeal to their sense of order. So their ability to muddy the waters with politics is far sort of less pronounced than the government side and typically the rebel group side. So one thing that is also very pronounced in the world of peace talks is an allergic reaction from the main parties to anything that smacks of a normative standard related to human rights writ large, let alone women's rights and gender. So what appears to be a much better tactical direction is to talk about sustainability and efficiency. So what we're increasingly doing in this world of peace processes is mounting an argument around how, when you are more inclusive and when you think about participation in more rounded, holistic terms, it leads to sustainable outcomes. And sustainability makes sense to the military, whereas it doesn't seem to make as much sense to the government officials. It's a really interesting, very separate set of conversations. In terms of the question around militia and sort of non-state armed groups, there is very interesting work that's being done by entities such as Geneva Call around getting those different rebel groups to abide by normative standards. But the question is, what is their motivation for doing so? Is it to legitimise themselves in the eyes of the international community, or is it more genuinely motivated? And of course the answer is it's a mixture of all of those things. And it's the same answer for the military. Why do certain militaries abide by particular normative standards at particular moments in time? It's a really complex set of issues. But if you're interested in that space, check out the work of Geneva Call, because they're getting armed groups to abide by what are called deeds of commitments, and they're monitoring them, and they're attempting to kind of create some sort of regulation in that very, 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 very large group of armed actors who cannot abide by international humanitarian law, etc., etc. So the other point that I wanted to make is that your question is about whether or not you're essentially working with the devil when you're working with the military. And I think that as people that are there to support alternate ideas around building peace, we have to work with the military to take another stand to say they are agents of violence and militarism. Whilst you can have that particular opinion and you can have that principled stand, I think when it comes to the machinery of how to build peace, I don't think you can get around engaging them.
I think that it's really important to be practical but it's very important while doing so you don't lose sight of the vision. And these two people were very practical. Gandhi was really saying that to be an effective nonviolent organizer, you need to be as organized as the military. So we really have to understand what nonviolence is. And yes, we use Gandhian principles and we analyze nonviolent movements. Martin Luther King also followed into Gandhi's footsteps, but also from a gender lens, because within the movements there have also been women saying some issues have been overlooked. But just going back to the vision, nonviolence is really about analyzing how does the injustice or the oppression work. Now, Gandhi was not about creating a kinder system of colonization, nor was Martin Luther King about creating a better, kinder, nicer system of discrimination. So I'm saying this because we still need to keep sight of the vision. Nonviolence is about working with everybody, because if you want to achieve social change or you want to address injustice, you can't demonize people. So you can't demonize soldiers or people that are in the military. So you will need to engage with this group because they are part of the roots, they're part of the pillars of the problem. But where I do think we need to really be very strategic and look very good at what we're doing is that we do not get lost in that territory. There's a lot of resources from our taxes going into war machines. There's a lot of our money being spent on fighting wars. And in terms of learning how to be a citizen that builds peace, our education systems are not providing for that. The organizations that are working for conflict prevention and that form of peace building are many times under-resourced. So my plea here is, we really need to reclaim that space. And there's a risk, I've seen it in the women, peace and security sector, that, many times we keep working on trying to change the systems that are part of the problem, and we're not enough investing in creating the alternative spaces or really demanding that these alternative spaces are being taken seriously. So I think this is really the dilemma that we need to look at very critically, because what also happens that in the women, peace and security community, once you're finally sitting at that table, the pacifist voice gets really easily silenced because you're finally there, so you don't want to start raising the difficult questions, so next you're out again. And I also want to say that I've had discussions with the military, and when sitting on the table like this, the language comes, 1325 is important, we will be more effective on the ground, we can reach out to the women on the ground. And when I had the private conversations, I was also told that it was a recruitment issue. There are less young men willing to join the military in many countries these days because there are better education opportunities for them. So they also have to diversify because they have to have a larger pool of people to draw from. So that's why they're also focusing on women. So I think really we need to be very critical, work with everyone, but make sure that we're not losing sight of the bigger vision that we have.